Hi there, it's Jo from Minerva. Today I'd like to show you how to French seam a sleeve. You wouldn't always French seam a sleeve, but if you're using a sheer fabric like chiffon or georgette or silk charmeuse, then you might want to French seam your sleeve into your sleeve hole so that around the armhole you don't see any seam allowances. It's a little bit fiddly, but let me show you how to do it. As with all French seaming, you're going to start by putting your fabric wrong sides together, which feels really strange when you're dropping a sleeve in. And I'm using some silk pins today so that I don't damage the fabric around the armhole. Let's take a look at pinning the sleeve in. So the first thing we need to do is to put the fabric wrong sides together, which feels very strange. So you should see your side seam and you should see your sleeve seam when you're pinning this together. You're going to go and find now those notches. So there's a back notch, that's 2 marks, and a front notch on the other side. Your pattern has easing stitches, pull those up before you pin the sleeve head, or if there's an actual gather feature, pull up your gather threads so that your sleeve fits inside your sleeve head. Make sure your gathers are evenly distributed or your easing stitches melt away into the seam allowance. You've got to keep moving them and adjusting them, and you've got to be even more patient than normal when you're using a chiffon fabric. Once you've got your sleeve all ready, you're then going to set up your sewing machine. So make sure you've got a small stitch length and a sharps needle. So my stitch length, take it back from my easing stitch back down to 2, and I've got a sharps needle in so that I don't get lots of shots around the edge. I've got a 1.5 seam allowance, so I'm going to sew my first line of stitching by using a 7mm seam allowance, and then I'm going to sew my next one at 7 as well, and then that's 14, and that gives me sort of millimetre on my fold. So the first line is 7mm. Don't stretch or pull your fabric. You might find it easy to take your extension table off and just have the sleeve on the foot plate. Now with some very sharp scissors, you're going to take out half of that seam allowance. So cut it back to 1/8 of an inch or 3 or 4 millimeters, sorry. Especially if it's a bit hairy and it's started to fray a bit, it will just stop any little frayed bits from poking out on your shoulder. So this is the right side of my top, this is the centre front seam, these are the shoulder seams. I've got my seam on the outside, so now I'm going to pinch that seam allowance into the fabric, turn the fabric to the wrong side and pin again all the way round at the next 7mm seam allowance. This is where you want to really try and roll the fabric over. Some people try and press it, but I think sometimes it's just best to use your fingers just to roll the fabric, especially if it's sheer chiffon or georgette. And you're making sure that the seam allowance is inside your French seam. I'm going to take that back to the machine and sew around the second pass at 7mm. So your sleeve is now set into the armhole. You can't see any fabric fraying underneath or a zigzag cut or anything like that. You can give that a light press, but you'll need to use a press cloth. But you've got the sleeve head smooth. You can turn the seam allowance to the top and you can give it a press on a ham, would give it that really nice sleeve head shape. So that is how you do a French seam on a sleeve. Second one to go. Because we pre-pressed the sleeve hems with starch, I now don't have to try and get an iron in there to get a press on the seam allowances. So I can just turn that down one more time. You will get a thicker seam allowance now, and you may see that through the fabric. This is a pattern fabric, so you can't see it, but if you've got a plain fabric, so say you had a white chiffon, you would see a seam allowance through the fabric, and that might be desirable, or you might want to make a really narrow hem. So you can do a double folded hem like this using a bit of starch and a hot hemmer, or pre-pressing your hem, or you can try a narrow or rolled hem. I hope that's helped and given you some confidence to maybe try sewing in a chiffon fabric. Of course, you can use French seams for all of your seams when you sew with chiffon, but if you've got the confidence to do a sleeve as well, it can really give a great finish. Thanks very much for watching. See you again soon.